Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:13 p.m. in a very cold, icy, snowy Budapest. Needless to say, it's dark and sunless and lightless and everything else. But on top of it, of all, it's also snowing, and it's very, very um, um, kind of unpleasant. I don't even ride my bicycle. I don't ride my bicycle when the snow on the streets. Um, I ride when there's rain. I don't mind the rain, but the snow is a little difficult. It gets a little slippery. Anyway, a few things that I want to talk about today, and today's been a rather a strange day in that. We started off the day with this strong declaration from various NATO countries, um, denouncing. Denouncing maybe is a little bit strong, but expressing their concern and hostility to the Trump administration's threats to take over Greenland. And this is obviously, they're very, very upset about that. And we'll take a look at that statement that they issued today. And then the day culminated with one of these Coalition of the Willing meetings in Paris. And in that meeting, they made a pledge to, yes, offer security guarantees to Ukraine and to deploy forces, British and French forces, in Ukraine after a ceasefire. And of course, the corollary of that is that these forces will not be deployed without the United States providing that favorite word of Keir Starmer, the backstop. You have to have the American backstop because, of course, the Europeans are not going to put themselves in harm's way without the American support. So, on the one hand, you have the demands that Trump knock it off with all this talk about Greenland and threatening little Denmark. And then on the other hand, you say, well, can you please support us in Ukraine because we basically aren't able to do these things by ourselves. So let's take a look at that statement issued by these countries, which is the and we'll see first of all who signed onto this statement on Greenland, and says the joint statement on Greenland. So Macron, of course, Merz, yes, Maloney, yup, Tusk, Sanchez of Spain, Starmer of the UK, and of course Frederiksen of Denmark. So they are the ones who signed on to this statement, essentially very, very concerned about this belligerent talk on Greenland, and particularly emanating from Stephen Miller, and we'll come to that in a moment. So here there's a statement. Arctic security remains a key priority for Europe, and it is crucial for international and transatlantic security. All right. And NATO has made clear that the Arctic region is a priority, and European allies are stepping up. We and many other allies have increased our presence, activities, and investments to keep the Arctic safe and to deter adversaries. Now, this is already very interesting, and here you can see how they're using this. I mean, Trumpian language, but maybe even going beyond Trump, because the they're saying, we're going to keep the adversaries away from Greenland, or the Arctic rather, here Arctic, and say, well, why? Um, of all countries in the world, that has the biggest border with the Arctic is, of course, Russia. How can you keep Russia out from the Arctic when it actually is an Arctic power, the biggest Arctic power in the world? Far more so than the countries that signed on to the statement. The UK is not an Arctic power. Germany is not an Arctic power. France is not an Arctic power. Italy is not an Arctic power. Um, the United States only gets to be an Arctic power because of Alaska. But you could say the adversaries, and then you say, well, Russia, as if Russia has no right to be in the Arctic. And so let's take a look further, with this statement. And then, and so deter adversaries. Okay, the Kingdom of Denmark, including Greenland, is part of NATO, right? Security in the Arctic must therefore be achieved collectively in conjunction with NATO allies, including the United States, by upholding the principle of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, territorial integrity, and inviolability of borders. These are universal principles, and we will not stop defending them, except, of course, when you go around violating the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and inviolability of borders of others, and particularly in the case of Yugoslavia, and then, of course, Serbia. And, of course, you went ahead and bombed and invaded lots and lots of other countries. So, forget that, but these are the principles that guide us. Anyway, it goes on. The United States is an essential partner in this endeavor as a NATO ally and through the defense agreement between the Kingdom of Denmark and the United States of 1951. And Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland and them only to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. So Greenland belongs to its people. It is for Denmark and Greenland and them only to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. So right away, this is ridiculously sanctimonious and fraudulent because, of course, we know that these very same countries, not so long ago in 2008, decided that they were going to lop Kosovo off Serbia. And the one thing that they made clear then, that Serbia will have no say in the matter. So this was Kosovo was an integral part of Serbia, internationally recognized as being a part of Serbia. And these very same countries, UK, France, Italy, Germany, the usual gang, said, well, Serbia has no say in the matter. So, well, it was a territorial, integral part of Serbia. Well, Serbia has no say in the matter. So now, if you say, oh, no, you can't make these decisions without consulting Denmark and Greenland. Well, hey, that's you did that then, and you're going to have it now. This is the United States. The United States is NATO. No NATO without the United States, and that's why, as we'll see, this coalition of the willing stuff only gets off the ground if the United States decides that he wants to get involved in this. But if it doesn't, then there'll be no forces in Ukraine. So that's why right away when they say these things, well, this is good, as if somehow, they're very unhappy about these threats to Denmark and Greenland. Well, you are very, very junior partners in an alliance that is run by the United States. And the United States basically says, well, we really aren't interested in all of this unless we get something out of it. And Trump says, well, what are we getting out of it? I said, well, we want to get Greenland. We want to get Greenland out of this. Now, whether you need Greenland or you don't need Greenland, I mean, that's what the administration is saying. Um, so, I mean, the problem is that these countries don't really have much of a leg to stand on. They've already jettisoned the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. They show that they don't care about that. And they've already made clear that they can't really do anything without the United States. So when the United States says, well, all right, well, we'll do what you want, but we need to get something out of it, you don't really have much of a leg to stand on. And I don't know what the United States will do if they press their case. I'm assuming they're going to start coercing Denmark in order to come up with a price. Name a price that you'll sell Greenland to us, or lease it to us for 100 years, or something along those lines. But they're going to do it, and these Europeans really don't have much of a leg to stand on. But anyway, that was the statement, and then that the usually media are very, very indignant about all of this, and here we have Politico. NATO is done if Trump invades Greenland. Danish PM warns. That's that's the Frederiksen woman. And it's very interesting because Frederiksen had up to now been saying that the biggest threat that Denmark faces is from Russia, which seems a little odd because Denmark is nowhere near Russia. But nonetheless, she's insisted on this, that Denmark faces this huge threat from Russia. She made a lot of nonsense a couple of months ago. Remember about the drones, all these drones coming to Copenhagen. She thought Russians were behind this. She never had any evidence of this, but she declared, well, the primary threat facing Denmark is Russia. And now she's kind of woken up and said, well, hey, we got the United States, our greatest ally, is basically telling us, hand over Greenland or we're done. And so here she is, as quoted in Politico, that NATO is done if Trump invades Greenland. And if US President Donald Trump invades Greenland, it will spell the end of NATO, Denmark's leader warned. Trump, who last week ratcheted up threats to take over the self-ruling Danish territory in the Arctic, should be, quote, taken, quote, seriously when he says that he wants Greenland, Frederiksen said in an interview. And then she goes on, but I will also make it clear that if the US chooses to attack another NATO country militarily, then everything stops, including NATO, and thus the security that has been established since the end of the Second World War. Now, to some, to many of us, reading that, it's like fantastic. I mean, it's the end of NATO, so that's all it takes to end NATO. Just attack, take over Greenland. That sounds like a good deal. I'm still not exactly sure what Trump really thinks of NATO, but I don't think he's terribly worried about NATO coming to an end. So that threat on the part of Frederiksen, that this will be the end of NATO. I think I don't think that's going to act as a disincentive for Trump. Um, anyway, then we have this is she went on. This is from this is a tweet that repeats her comments. I have to say this very directly to the United States. It makes absolutely no sense to talk about the need for the United States to take over Greenland. The United States has no right to annex any of the three countries in the Commonwealth. Well, I guess they have no right to do so, but that doesn't mean that they won't assert a right to do so. I mean, if you resolutely ignore international law, as the EU and NATO do on a regular basis, um, you can't then start invoking this international law and say, well, the United States has no right to annex any of the three countries in the Commonwealth. The United States says we have a right because they're vital for NATO security, and since we are NATO, then we would just assert our right, and that's all there is to it. The Kingdom of Denmark and thus Greenland is part of NATO and is therefore covered by the alliance's security guarantee. We already have a defense agreement between the Kingdom and the United States today, which gives the United States wide access to Greenland. And we, on the part of the Kingdom, have invested significantly in security in the Arctic. I would therefore strongly urge the United States to stop the threats against a historically close ally and against another country and another people who have said very clearly that they are not for sale. Well, okay. I mean, but I think as Trump has demonstrated, I mean, he's not really going to be put off by this kind of talk, um, and so this is you know basically the United States has decided that Greenland is vital for its security, security of NATO, whatever. There's no point in arguing about that. And Denmark can make all sorts of claims, and Denmark obviously has quite strong legal claims to Denmark. Denmark has strong legal claims to Greenland, but at the same time, what do these claims really amount to? As we'll talk, I want to talk about the Maduro situation a little later. These international law strictures really don't mean a great deal, and incidentally, no one really cares that much about international law. For all the huffing and puffing about Maduro, no one seems to really care about the actual international law aspect of what the United States did in Venezuela, which just shows that international law really, there's no real there are no real takers for international law. Anyway, let's go on a little bit more with the Greenland thing, and here is the Guardian. European leaders rally behind Greenland as U.S. ramps up threats. And then they talk about the Stephen Miller. In an interview with CNN, Miller said military intervention would not be needed in order to gain control over Greenland because of its small population. He also suggested that Denmark does not have a right to the Arctic territory, which is a former Danish colony and remains part of its kingdom. Copenhagen continues to control Greenland's foreign and security policy. Asked whether military action against Greenland was off the table, he incorrectly stated that its population was 30,000 when in fact it is 57,000, saying, "What do you mean military action against Greenland? Greenland has a population of 30,000 people." I don't think whether it's 30,000 or 57,000, I don't think that will vitiate his argument. His argument is that it's the size, the population is the size of a kind of a small American city, so therefore there's the resistance is going to be quite pointless. The real question is, what right does Denmark have to assert control over Greenland? What is the basis of their territorial claim? What is their basis of having Greenland as a colony? And then he added, the US is the power of NATO. For the US to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be a part of the US. And so that's the conversation that we're going to have as a country. That's the process we're going to have as a community of nations. There was, he said, no need to think or talk about a military operation in Greenland, adding, nobody is going to fight the US militarily over the future of Greenland. That doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, fresh from his military operation in Venezuela, the US president said on Sunday the US needed Greenland very badly, renewing fears of a US invasion of that largely autonomous island. So you can see here that, that I would think, trying to figure out Trump's way of thinking, that he will want to leave a permanent mark, so that when he leaves office in 3 years, he will have, as his lasting legacy, Greenland is now part of the United States. And I actually think that Denmark, if the United States is determined to take Greenland, I don't think that they're going to be able to do much to stop this, because Mette Frederiksen said, well, this will be the end of NATO if we're attacked by the United States. Well, I don't think it's going to come to an attack, but it also means that the NATO states will have to make a decision, really. What is it? What really matters to them? Do they want to keep NATO going, or do they want to stick with Greenland? And then they have to ask, well, why are you digging in your heels about Greenland? What do you care about Greenland? I mean, nobody even talked about Greenland until Trump raised the issue. So are you gonna really allow NATO to dissolve itself over Greenland? No. The answer is, of course not. So this is all empty posturing. Now, I would love it if NATO did indeed dissolve itself. I mean, I think that would be absolutely fantastic. But if when the crunch comes, as it will, on Greenland, I think NATO is going to make a decision. We want to keep the United States on board, particularly if we're going to get the United States backstop on Ukraine. And that brings us to the what happened in the latter part of today, which was this yet another one of these coalition of the willing meetings in Paris. And here we have the class photo, and here they all are. This is a big group. I can't see everybody. I can see Starmer right in the front row. I can see Maloney, I think, doing her faces. Ursula is there standing next to Maloney. And then there's, of course, the U.S. Emissaries, which is Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Zelensky, of course, right in the middle. I think that's Mark Rutte next to him. Can't tell. It's not a good picture. But there's also Tusk. No, it's not Rutte. I think it's the Swedish guy, because Rutte is there on the left. And there's the Canadian guy, Mark Carney. And then you got the also rans in the back. Um, and so that so it's a big group, coalition of the willing, and they agree to deploy forces to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. Now the point is, but when you present it in that way, and since we know that Russia has said they're not going to accept NATO forces, whether they're under NATO command or not, they're not going to accept them in Ukraine, and you say that it's in the event of a peace deal, then that would surely suggest that Russia would have no interest at all in a peace deal if it means that at the end of it, there will be NATO forces in Ukraine. So, therefore, as always, the whole purpose of these kinds of meetings is twofold. First of all, to lock the United States into any kind of security guarantees for Ukraine, but more important, to keep the war going in the hope that within 3 years Trump will be gone and he'll be replaced by somebody much more favorably inclined towards Ukraine and NATO. But that's why there's this obvious contradiction between your first part of the day when you start blustering about how the Americans are threatening us over Greenland, and then you come, oh well, but we need you Americans here in Ukraine, which is apparently an existential matter now for Europe, and while clearly Trump isn't particularly interested. Anyway, so here's we have this draft statement being drafted. Multinational force would ensure regeneration of Ukrainian armed forces. That's from the draft statement. We have some more of the draft statement drawn up by Ukraine's Western allies in the event that end to this war is achieved. It would provide crucial security guarantees to Kiev to help deter future Russian aggression. Then the statement says there will be continuous, reliable ceasefire monitoring system that will be led by the U.S. with international participation. But this is where they start doing this playing around with words, which is ceasefire monitoring or buttressing Ukrainian forces. Because ceasefire, anyone can just do ceasefire monitoring. So what exactly do they mean by continuous, reliable ceasefire monitoring? And then the multinational force. So, and why do you need a multinational force for ceasefire monitoring? The multinational force to be deployed after a ceasefire would provide reassurance measures in the air, at sea, on land. So now you can see this is becoming a forced deployment on behalf of Ukraine. So in other words, it's actually a war-fighting force that you intend to insert into Ukraine. So it's this effortlessly gliding from ceasefire monitoring to reassurance measures in the air, at sea, and on land, and ensure the regeneration of the armed forces of Ukraine. What's that got to do with ceasefire monitoring? These elements will be European led. There would be US participation in the force, of course, including US capabilities such as intelligence and logistics. Logistics is always nice, basically anything like transport, equipment, armaments, all of that will come from the United States. And a U.S. commitment to support the force in case of an attack by Russia. So when you talk about U.S. commitment to support the force in case of an attack by Russia, then you're already talking about a very substantial U.S. commitment. There would be binding commitments to support Ukraine in the case of a future armed attack by Russia in order to restore peace. So that's a war-fighting capability. These commitments may include the use of military capabilities, intelligence, and logistical support, diplomatic initiatives, adoption of additional sanctions, and then Russia has repeatedly opposed any NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine to monitor a halt in hostilities. Yeah, yeah. So again, they're just simply talking among themselves. And that's the whole point. They need to be talking as if, oh, we're coming close to a peace agreement when they know perfectly well that they're nowhere near any kind of an agreement. And here's Starmer. This was the statement that he issued after the Coalition of the Willing meeting wrapped up. And here's our European American allies, side by side with President Zelensky, standing for peace, and we are closer to that goal than ever. But the hardest yards are still ahead. So we're here to keep driving that effort forward. It's very interesting. It uses the word yards, which, I mean, obviously, for in English-speaking countries such as the UK and the United States and Canada, they know what a yard is. But you know, the rest of the coalition of the willing are probably a little confused as to what a yard is. We signed a declaration of intent on the deployment of forces to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. This is a vital part of our Iron Cast commitment to stand with Ukraine for the long term. It paves the way for the legal framework under which British, French, and partner forces could operate on Ukrainian soil, and then securing Ukraine's skies and seas, regenerating Ukraine's armed forces, and the UK and France will establish military hubs across Ukraine. I like the word military hubs, and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment. That's quite a ceasefire monitoring force. Build some military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment. So, as I say, all of this is being done with a view to ensuring Russian refusal. To support Ukraine's defensive needs and with our coalition partners, we also have agreed significant further steps. First, that we will participate in US-led monitoring and verification of a ceasefire. Second, we will support the long-term provision of armaments for Ukraine's defense. And third, we will work towards binding commitments to support Ukraine in the case of a future armed attack by Russia. But we can only get to a peace deal if Putin is ready to make compromises. Notice how it's Putin. They don't refer to Russia, so it's just Putin. And so we have to be frank, for all of Russia's words, Putin is not showing that he is ready for peace. So, well, if he's not showing that he's ready for peace, why are you talking about these binding commitments in the event of a ceasefire? And so you all this talk, oh, we're really very close. He starts off, just a few yards left. And then he said, well, Putin is not showing that he's ready for peace. Over the last few weeks, we've seen the opposite, further horrific strikes on Ukraine, killing and wounding civilians, and cutting off power from millions of people in the dead of winter. And so his forces hit a hospital in Kiev just yesterday, and he has tried to distract from peace efforts with unfounded claims of attacks on his residence. They weren't unfounded. We've talked about that. Now, this only hardens our resolve. We will continue to step up our support to Ukraine's defense in 2026 to ensure it gets the equipment and backing it needs to continue the fight, and we will keep up the pressure on Russia, including further measures on the oil traders and shadow fleet operators funding Putin's war chest. We will continue these efforts until they come to the table in good faith and until we realize the goal that we all share of a just and lasting peace. So everything it says here is what has already been tried. Every single thing, So we're going, binding commitments, forces deployed in Ukraine. We're going to keep up the pressure on Putin. We're going to get him to the negotiating table. All you've already done all that. You have no basis whatever that just applying more pressure is going to get him to the negotiating table. And they just keep doing this. So you have this whole coalition of the willing, this huge meeting, and then at the end, well, this is nothing. This is something you are guaranteeing a Russian rejection, and your only um, policy is is to continue doing what you've been doing without any great success. Um, but that's the you want the Americans in, and at the same time you tell the Americans, hey, you can't have Greenland. It's ours. Greenland. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to talk about is with the thing with Maduro. It's there's nobody getting overwrought. It's illegal and so on. We know all that. But what is most peculiar about what Trump did is that he's given that he's given ammunition to the very people who really absolutely detest and despise him, because what he by essentially seizing Maduro, hauling him off to a court in the United States, he's essentially asserting that universal jurisdiction that you would have thought any conservative, and particularly a conservative like Trump, a nationalist populist like Trump, would be very, very wary of. Because this really goes back to the era of the glory era of universal jurisdiction. It was back in the 1990s, the era of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. Because up until then, the principle that had always been recognized is the sovereign equality of states. Not that states are obviously not equal; some are more powerful than others, but there was a basic sovereign equality, and what that meant was that one state did not have the right to judge the actions of another state in any kind of a court of law. And that, of course, went together with sovereign immunity. That basically, for acts of state, you basically have immunity. They're just acts of state. And one has to keep in mind that sovereign immunity is actually even stronger in the case of the leader of another state than the immunity that the US Supreme Court had argued on behalf of Trump. You remember what the US Supreme Court decided in the case of Trump in 2024 was that he enjoys immunity for his official acts. He has no immunity for his personal acts, but he does enjoy immunity for his official acts. But the immunity that inheres with the leaders of states is absolute, both for their official acts and for their personal acts. You cannot put, a Maduro or, the leader of any country on trial, at least while they're actually president. When they it becomes a bit, this becomes a bit different when they're no longer president. But they still have immunity. But while they're actually president, they are immune for their personal actions and their official actions. So, and and we know this. I mean, it sounds strange, but we know this in principle when we look at diplomatic immunity. What does diplomatic immunity mean? Because a diplomat is the representative of a foreign state, and they enjoy immunity for their official acts and their personal acts. So that if your diplomat commits rape in your country, you can't put him on trial. You can kick him out of the country, but you can't put him on trial. He enjoys immunity. So it's an immunity that goes to his official acts as well as his personal acts. That's the principle. That's what diplomatic immunity, and diplomatic immunity inheres from sovereign immunity. There's a representative of a state, which means that one state cannot put on trial, official representatives of another state. Because if they did, if that were possible, then you basically have absolute bedlam in international affairs. Can you imagine if you could actually start issuing arrest warrants for the leaders of states? Imagine Montenegro decides that well, we don't really like Viktor Orban's policy towards Russia. So we'll just simply say, well, he's committed a crime, because you can just invent a crime, saying, well, he's violating the UN Declaration of Human Rights. He's violating the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I don't like his LGBTQ plus policies, so we'll just issue an arrest warrant. I mean, this is in fact where you would get to. States would just simply be engaged in continually issuing arrest warrants against the leaders of other states, and then going straight to Interpol and say, "Oh, can you please enforce this arrest warrant, please? Because we're signatories to the European I forgot the name of the European extradition treaty, and so please enforce this arrest warrant against Orban or anyone." So, in the same way that when the Supreme Court ruled that Trump enjoys immunity for his official acts, the principle they had, well, we can't, otherwise, if he didn't, then you would have every district attorney in the country will be issuing arrest warrants against the president. But the same thing goes in international affairs. You would always be issuing arrest warrants for the leaders of states that you don't like. And then, you can even go further. You can, basically hide the arrest warrant, keep somebody not even informed that there's an outstanding arrest warrant, then you can just simply seize him. Boom. Viktor Orban visits, Austria, and boom, he's arrested in Austria, and so, but this is in fact where you would get to. And how do we avoid that? We avoid that by declaring that states are immune. They do not, they cannot fall under the jurisdiction of another state. So Maduro, the United States, has no jurisdiction whatsoever over Maduro. This is an obvious point, and this is what I was saying earlier, that in all this talk, condemnations of Trump, nobody actually addresses this point, and they don't want to address this point, because the people who don't like Trump don't want to accept that principle, sovereign immunity, because that's what's always guided international affairs in the past. Because otherwise you would always have leaders getting arrested by other states. So we'll go, well, hey, he's violated the law. Now he's in prison. Now, so going back to what I was saying about the 1990s, you see, the 1990s, in the glory days of Tony Blair, and and Bill Clinton, they went absolutely berserk with this whole universal jurisdiction, and so I don't know if people remember this. They arrested Augusto Pinochet while he was visiting in London. Now, that was a very interesting episode because Pinochet had already stepped down as president of Chile. He was visiting London, and then lo and behold, he was arrested. He was arrested pursuant to an arrest warrant issued by Judge Garcon of Spain. And then you thought, well, how does Spain have any jurisdiction at all over Pinochet? I mean, if Pinochet committed any crimes, then presumably he committed the crimes in Chile, and therefore it's the Chilean people who have any jurisdiction over Pinochet. But no, the Garcon said no, because he violated the UN Convention on Torture, and so therefore we have universal jurisdiction. Any court at all can just simply decide that they're going to put him on trial. Totally made up. It's completely made up. I mean, because yes, there is a UN Convention against torture, but there was no provisions within that convention to set up courts and to put people on trial. They didn't set up any kind of tribunals or anything like that. They just said, well, yeah, that's what these conventions. What do they do? I mean, they are statements of intent. They're not meant to be, criminal law, criminal statutes. That if you violate the statute, then a policeman's going to come knocking on your door. That's never really been the intent when they formulated these laws, the laws of war, like the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions. They would just say, well, these are the principles that will guide future lawfare. But they didn't say, well, if you violate it, then you're going to be hauled off in a court. And then certainly no one said the court of one country is going to adjudicate acts that took place in another country, and not even against the citizens of the first country. But this, as I say, this was the heyday of this universal jurisdiction, and everybody applauded this. Fantastic. This was and the British government, which had behaved quite slimily in this, because they knew about this arrest warrant, and they knew that Pinochet himself was not aware of this arrest warrant that had been. It was a secret arrest warrant. That he didn't know about this arrest warrant. So the British government they'd given him a visa to enter the country, even though they knew that there was this arrest warrant pending. So Pinochet was really denied even any ability to challenge the validity of this arrest warrant. The British said, well, we have to go through the whole extradition process, and that went on for quite a long time. I think 1998. So I think it went on for 3-4 years, I think. And the courts in Britain kind of ruled generally, I mean, in favor of extradition. And finally, the House of Lords ruled that he can indeed be extradited. Now, at that point, the British government, I think, began to get cold feet, and they thought. They knew this whole Iraq war thing was coming, and they began getting a little nervous, because if you're going to start asserting universal jurisdiction, any country anywhere can just go ahead and arrest the leader of another country. Well, they're going to use that against you. And there's plenty of people who would love to arrest Tony Blair uh, for um, for what he did in Iraq. So the British government, once the final, this was the final ruling by the House of Lords saying yes, Pinochet can be extradited to Spain. They decided, well, Pinochet is in poor health. Maybe it's not in the best interest of justice to transfer him to Spain. So they sent him back to Chile. Um, so all that, after all that, they said, well, he's not in the best of health, so we're not going to send him to Spain. But the point was, this was, who were the people who were advocating the that Pinochet should be handed over to Spain? Well, this was all the crowd, all the NGOs, the Human Rights Brigade, all the liberal do-gooders, the very people who absolutely loathe Trump, the very people that they want to see Trump in prison for the rest of his life, the very people, incidentally, would have put him in prison had he lost that election. Had he lost that election, Trump would be in prison really to the rest of his life. I mean, he had already been convicted in New York. Remember, his conviction in New York, that carried a prison term. That was a substantial prison term. The 34 counts of 34 felony counts that he was convicted of. So he would absolutely be serving prison time for what he had already been convicted of. And then, of course, there was the case in D.C., the January the 6th case, and a D.C. jury, absolutely a D.C. jury would have found him guilty. So that would have been additional prison time. And then, of course, you've got the Georgia case, Fulton County in Georgia. They hate Trump as well. So that would have also been another conviction. He would have been in prison for the rest of his life. So it's very strange for Trump to start asserting the principle that there is no such thing as sovereign immunity, because that's his get out card. That's his ability to stay out of jail, because they're going to come after him again. I mean, once the Democrats regain the House, they're going to impeach him, and now he probably has the votes to survive. That's what it looks like, but you can't always be sure. But he's basically, what keeps him out of jail, in principle, is the sovereign immunity, because once he leaves office, and that's what 3 years down the road, there will be attempts to prosecute him. No question, there will be attempts to prosecute him. That he's going to be fighting off these lawsuits, criminal prosecutions, and his argument will be sovereign immunity. But as I say, his immunity is actually less than the immunity of Maduro, because his immunity, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, only applies to his official acts, because that's within the jurisdiction of the United States. But for a foreign leader, his immunity applies to everything. It applies to his official acts and applies to his personal acts. So you got nothing of that. And Maduro, in his defense, he's going to say, whatever I did as president of Venezuela, with drugs or whatever, I did in the interests of the state. I did because I was the president, and I did whatever I needed to do to ensure the survival and well-being of the Venezuelan people. That was my job. That was and that's every leader of every sovereign state will say that what I did was in order to strengthen the well-being of my people. So that was, and of course, as I say, it was the heyday of universal jurisdiction. And of course, they did that with Milosevic. And I mean, it's a kind of an irony. Tony Blair, who was gleeful, oh, fantastic, we're going to bring whole Milosevic out to the ICTY, and then we're going to convict him, and we'll show that what NATO did was glorious, and so morally righteous. We bombed a war criminal. We brought a war criminal to justice. But of course, that again was a total violation of sovereign immunity, because everything, of course, that Milosevic did, he did as the leader of his people. Did he commit war crimes? Well, maybe. Who knows? Um, it, it's going to be quite difficult to prove that he knowingly committed war crimes. There may be people who, under his command, who had committed war crimes. Doesn't mean he committed the war crimes. But no one was really interested in that. They just wanted to establish the very principle that you can grab a leader, a president of he was the president of Yugoslavia. He had been the president of Serbia. That you can just grab him, arrest him, haul him into prison, and then he's going to be sitting in court, preferably in a glass booth, and then prosecutors are going to be raining down their denunciations. The drawback, of course, for Tony Blair and Bill Clinton was that, well, if you're going to do that to Milosevic, then if you're really going to insist on universal jurisdiction, somebody's going to come and do it to you. Now they probably won't, just because you have muscle. But you've established a principle. You've established a principle that there's no such thing as sovereign immunity. And now the ICC and the ICTY, they make these declarations like, well, just because somebody's a head of state, that doesn't mean he has immunity. Okay, well, anyone can say anything you like. I mean, just because they said it in the statutes, like in the Rome statute, or they say it in the ICTY statute, that doesn't make it the case. Of course, they have sovereign immunity. And so what the ICTY and the ICC do in a very dishonest way is that they declare that when you commit war crimes, then you're committing war crimes as an individual, not as a head of state. But of course, that's just simply, essentially you're doing a tautology, because you say, well, because they know they have to address the issue of the sovereign immunity. But then they say, oh, well, they're acting as an individual. Of course, you're not an individual. When you're head of state, you're not acting as an individual. You're acting as the embodiment of the state, embodiment of your people. You may do some cruel things, but that's still that's still the principle of sovereignty. And so, but my point is that this is something that Trump should absolutely have nothing to do with. And the people who are jumping up with joy and the idea that, oh, great, Maduro's in court, are the same people who want to see Trump in court, because they have no respect for that very principle of sovereign immunity, the sovereign equality of states. One state does not have jurisdiction over another state. That's that just doesn't happen. So therefore, therefore he, as the president of Venezuela, he does not recognize the jurisdiction. Rightly, he does not recognize the jurisdiction of the United States over the actions of Venezuela. So that's Venezuela is a sovereign state. United States is a sovereign state. United States has no jurisdiction over Venezuela. Venezuela does not recognize the jurisdiction of the United States. As you nothing. And the nationalist populace should basically, you should acknowledge this, rather than align yourself with the universal jurisdiction types. That is to be, you know, joining forces with them. So let's anyway. So that's my view. I mean, it's a very peculiar thing that Trump has done, and certainly doesn't advance his interests in any way at all. All right, let's now take a look at our Gaggle locals page, where the Gagglers congregate and make sure that the dogs are in a um, reasonably good mood. I mean, it's not a good time to be in a good mood, because we have the weather is cold, obviously, and the one thing that could keep you going when the weather is cold is, the sight of a tip jar filling up. When it's not filling up, then that puts them in a foul mood. So, but thank you to all the Gagglers who make sure that that um, the dogs have something to keep them warm and in a reason in a reasonably benign mood through the winter months. So thank you all Gagglers. Anyway, so welcome here, and then we have Stone River, who kicks off the questions. Thank you very much, Stone River. He says, "Is the Donroe Doctrine a Trojan horse for the U.S. to continue to be the world's policeman, just more aggressively so? There is always somewhere next to your neighborhood. Sarah Palin could see Russia from her house, not to mention the physical distance doesn't matter in cyberspace." Um, well, that's very interesting. Is because and that really does get to the heart of what is Trump doing here. Is Trump just going to make this very limited operation, which is essentially a coup? He's toppled um, Maduro. There's a change in personnel. He hasn't um, embraced regime change. In other words, he doesn't want the Chavistas out of power. He speaks warmly, quite warmly, about Delcy Rodriguez, the new president. Um, so then you say, okay, well, is he now going to extend what he did in Venezuela to elsewhere? If I if I were to put a bet down, I'd say yes, he will. And the reason why I think he will is that that's what people do. That's human nature. If you've done something and it seems like it's a success, then you say, okay, well, let me do this again, and therefore you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble, because next time it's not going to be so easy. And that's why I think in terms of when NATO bombed Yugoslavia, was 1999, and NATO certainly took it to be a great success. They thought, hey, we did it. We defeated Serbia. You would have thought, well, that, not exactly a great military accomplishment. We got rid of Milosevic. He was toppled. We got him into court. We can do anything we like. We're so powerful. And then, of course, that was the hubris that led to the Iraq invasion, because hey, we did it once, we're going to do it again. So that's why I tend to think that Trump will not be restrained and just say, okay, we did a limited thing, we're not going to try this again. I think he will try it again. So is this, the world's policeman? Yeah, maybe. I mean, he's already, leave aside the Greenland thing, which I kind of want to see him do that, because I just find Denmark so obnoxious, and I find NATO generally so absolutely insufferable, and aggressive, and a threat to world peace and everything else. So I want to see NATO break up. So I do hope that he will decide that he's going to take Greenland um, away from Denmark. So that's the part that I look forward to. But the is he going to extend this to Iran? Maybe, uh, because I mean, he's blustering now about Iran. Obviously, Netanyahu wants to get him involved in, in some kind of a military campaign against Iran. Yeah, I can see Trump going for it. Um, so some of his more cautious instincts, I think, will be. I think they'll be much diminished. I think he's going to start taking risks. I mean, he's already taking much greater risks than he was during his first term. Remember, during his first term, he really was quite wary of engaging in any military action. You remember, John Bolton wanted him to bomb Iran. He didn't want to do it. John Bolton wanted him to get directly, militarily involved against Venezuela. He didn't do it. He's now done both. Got himself militarily involved in Venezuela. He has bombed Iran. So he's already done things that he wasn't willing to do during his first term. Um, so I can see that. Absolutely. But I think that the holding Maduro off really just brings back, the worst era. I mean, this brings back the era of the 90s, the universal jurisdiction era. The notion that you can just simply hold leaders off and put them on trial. And so he's now embraced the vision of Tony Blair and Clinton and all of the people around at that time, which is kind of troubling. And I don't think that was exactly what people voted for in 2024. And certainly Trump never said anything like that during the campaign, that he intended to. Yes, I mean that the arrest warrant was there since 2020, but he never said, "Oh, I'm going to go ahead and grab Maduro." Um, so I tend to think that this is going to go to his head, and then he's gonna try this again. So anyway, thank you, Stone River. And then Dennis Misty says, "Good evening from North Yorkshire." Good evening. It's always good to have someone from North Yorkshire. I was looking at this goes back a long way. I was looking at an interview with Freddie Truman. Actually, I don't know whether he was from North Yorkshire or South Yorkshire or which part of Yorkshire he was from, but he was a famous um, cricketer, and a very good fast bowler, and and I mean, he was really before my time, but on YouTube you find lots of interviews with him. He had a way of expressing himself in that kind of quite dour, but rather humorous Yorkshire way. Uh, I was kind of always kind of liked him. Anyway, always good to hear from people in from North Yorkshire. Anyway, so thank you, and Dennis. Cynthia. Cynthia's I'm really looking forward to Cynthia's contributions today, because I actually wanted to talk about the film screening that we had yesterday, which was Nicholas and Alexandra. And as I always say, Cynthia's a brilliant film expert, a brilliant encyclopedist of cinema history. Is a real expert on every aspect of filmmaking, from editing, the sound, music, uh, set design, everything. I mean, she's just always fills us in with so much fascinating information. And then so yesterday we watched Nicholas and Alexandra, and as usual, Cynthia did her this extraordinary briefing for us. So we really learned a great deal about the making of this film and everything that went into it. why it was a success, why it wasn't a commercial success, and so on. So please, everybody, watch this film. It's a little long, and but as always, don't just watch the film. Uh, Read Cynthia's, really interesting, really illuminating points, because I learned a great deal. I know something about the subject, but I nonetheless learned a great deal from Cynthia's comments. So thank you so much, Cynthia. Anyway, so Cynthia says last night's film shows Nicholas as emotionally torn and politically out of his depth. Yep, putting a lot of weight on his belief that his family ties with Willie. Willie being Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who was of course a relative of his. But all the royals were kind of related to one another in those days. Could stop a war. That makes his shock when Germany declares war feel even more tragic, and it fits the movie's theme of an old style monarch overwhelmed by a modern crisis. But how accurate is that picture really? Did Nicholas truly believe his family connections would keep Germany from going to war with Russia? Well, I think the answer is yes. I think most people at the time thought that war could be avoided because it made little sense. I mean, yeah, he was related to Wilhelm, but Wilhelm was Queen Victoria's grandson. So then again, you think, well, why would England and Germany go to war when Willie was Queen Victoria's grandson? And Willie was, of course, Nicholas's cousin. So most people at the time thought, yes, there's this crisis, the July crisis in 1914 over the assassination of the Archduke, but sensible and cooler heads will prevail, and the crisis will be averted. Nicholas wasn't the only one in believing that, well, this isn't going to end in this horrific bloodbath. So I think that. Yeah, I think he did believe that, but he wasn't the only one to think that. But there's no question he was, he was out of his depth. But I think, where I think the film, obviously, I mean, it's already very long, but it doesn't entirely do justice to what was going on in Russia at that time. I mean, Russia was undergoing massive transformation, and particularly under Nicholas's reign, because his finance minister and then became his prime minister was Count Witte, Alexander Witte. He was the guy played by Eric Porter. He had launched this crash industrialization of Russia. So Russia, which was kind of fairly, up until really late 19th century, was pretty backward. I mean, mostly it was an agricultural state, very little industry. But then they launched this crash industrialization, and suddenly they were building railways, factories, getting coal out of the ground, coal, iron, steel. And Russia was becoming a major industrial power. There was a lot of investment, a lot of capital investment was going into Russia. And of course, by doing that, this induced panic in Germany because, Germany now suddenly saw, Russia's really becoming a serious economic power. 10 more years, and Russia will be a bigger industrial power than we are. And I think that was one of the fears. I mean, you have to think about, what was going on in the minds of Germany's leaders. The minds of Germany's leaders was that the constellation of forces was really working against Germany, because Russia was now industrializing rapidly, and so it was going to become a major economic power, which means that it would become a major military power. And then France also was becoming stronger, and they suddenly realized, the France of 1912-13, that's no longer the France of 1870 that Prussia managed to sweep aside easily. This is a much stronger France that we would be facing. So there was France and Russia. So Germany was feeling itself increasingly encircled, because France and Russia had signed essentially a dual alliance in 1890, but they kept renewing it. So that was with Witte. The problem with that crash industrialization that Russia had undergone was that well, you've now created a large industrial proletariat. Well, the proletariats are generally they're very problematic, and particularly when they have Bolsheviks amongst them. I mean, the Bolsheviks had already seen the industrial proletariat; that's their base, and so they became this proletariat was becoming quite difficult to control by the government. I mean, it's a corollary of this industrialization that you've got now a proletariat, and proletariats have been difficult to handle everywhere. They were difficult, but the British found them difficult to handle. The French found them difficult to handle. Germany, I think, had a little more success. Um, but so that was one aspect of this. And then there was but the industrialization we say Russia lost the war. Yes, Russia did lose the First World War. Russia withstood Imperial Germany for 3 years. The only reason it was able to withstand Imperial Germany for 3 years was the industrialization. The industrialization really built up Russia's military industrial complex, which nobody really thought that they'd be able to pull off. So they suffer this huge defeat in Tannenberg in 1914. That's 1914. They were able to fight on for another 3 years after Tannenberg. So so the film kind of makes us, oh, everything's hopeless and so on, but they don't make this point, which is, well, yeah, but after the Tannenberg, they still managed to fight for another 3 years against Germany. So there's that. Then there was, of course, sorry, I said Witte was played by Eric Porter. No, that's incorrect. Witte was played by Laurence Olivier. Stolypin, who was his successor, he was played by Eric Porter. But Stolypin was also an interesting figure because he kind of realized that the only way, because of this whole problem with the industrial proletariat, who were very radical, was if we kind of create a middle class, we need to create a peasant middle class. Because if you create this peasant middle class, that's a conservative force. That's what Napoleon III did. I mean, you got all this revolution in France in 1848, but once you made sure that the peasants, they got themselves a plot of land, they all, then they became a very conservative force. If they don't have any land, then they are a very radical force. So, if you want them, to be solid, middle class, conservative, supporting the government, you have to give them some land. And so he kind of undertook this quite radical agricultural reform and started creating these kind of reasonably prosperous peasant farmers in Russia who would indeed be supporters of the government. But he didn't really have enough time to develop this. But in principle, this was a very shrewd move, which is why, of course, he was assassinated. I mean, he was assassinated because these reforms were likely to lead to a conservative kind of middle class in the countryside. So I think the way Russia was presented in the film as a sort of this hopeless, helpless, ridiculous basket case is I think a little unfair. Nicholas was inadequate. I mean, he was basically a decent person. Clearly, he wasn't up to the task of a wartime leader. But the lunacy of 1914. I mean, Nicholas was part of that, but everyone else was involved in that. So it was there was plenty of blame to go around. Then, but there's a couple of other things I want to mention about the film yesterday. There's, first of all, there's a real issue there about the why Nicholas and his family were not saved by the British royal family. So George V was his cousin, and obviously once he had abdicated, he was in some peril, and it was very strange because it, Kerensky, who kind of took over the government after the abdication of Nicholas, Kerensky, and who was really liked and admired in Britain and France because he was a kind of a liberal, or whatever, social democrat, or whatever. They liked him. He was the one who had asked the British that they take Nicholas and his family, that they provide him with asylum, and then they essentially the British just did nothing. They kind of there was just no real interest in saving his life. But within a few months, really, Kerensky was no longer in power. So Kerensky takes over in March, but then in November, the Bolsheviks take over, and so by then Kerensky has no power. So then it became very difficult to save the life of Nicholas and his family, and that's always been it's very much of a mystery why exactly they didn't save his life, and I've never heard a satisfactory explanation. I mean, the usual explanation was that they were afraid that there would be agitation in Britain over if the Romanovs were brought into the country. I'm not buying that for 1 minute. First of all, they could have been brought into the country clandestinely. No one would really know about it, and so you just bring them in, set them up in a nice house somewhere in the country, and no one would be any of the wiser. Besides, in those days, people did as they were told. This is a wartime. You do as you're told, or you can always control public anger. Um, so I'm not. I don't find that a plausible explanation, and particularly, whatever you might say about Nicholas's rule and Tsarist absolutism, but even though he wasn't absolutist by then, there was a parliament and everything else. But whatever you can say, Nicholas was an ally. He was an ally in the First World War. I mean, they were fighting together. Nicholas's armies had fought in East Prussia in order to relieve the pressure on the Western Front. I mean, if it hadn't been for Nicholas, France would have probably been defeated in August 1914. I mean, so it was thanks to the Russians that the Germans had to fight on two fronts, and they weren't able to knock France out at the beginning of the war. So they owed it. They owed the Russians. So again, he was an ally. So you can't do something to save him, and you can't do it because even though the request came from Kerensky, from the kind of blue-eyed boy, briefly, of the Western powers. So I find that whole story, and remember, the story itself has always been obscured. I mean, I don't think many people in Britain ever really knew that Britain could have saved the Tsar and his family. I mean, that it was within their powers to do it, and that they refused to do so. Anyway, we'll go on, and then I'll say a little more. So Cynthia goes on, says, and Alexandra's German background became a real liability after 1914. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, she came from a kind of German royalty. Not the Hohenzollerns, but they have so many royal families in Germany. But there's some, I think Hesse, I think she was from. When an anti German feeling surged and rumors of treason spread, her isolation, reliance on Rasputin, and political role while Nicholas was at the front badly damaged the regime, yes, and made conspiracy theories easy to believe. In that sense, the film has a point. Her Germanness did fuel hostility and distrust, but how much did it really matter in the empire's collapse? Oh, I don't think it mattered very much, but it led to the kind of sense of uh, collapse in morale, and there was also a lot of resentment among the, the elites in what was it, in Petrograd, because and sh- she was making a lot of decisions. He had gone off to the front, so she was making a lot of decisions, and the elites in Petrograd were believed, not without reason, that she was making these decisions under the influence of Rasputin, and that's why I mean there was this real hostility grew towards Rasputin and the influence he was exerting over her, because she would fire ministers on the advice of Rasputin. She would hire people on the advice of Rasputin, and so that's why essentially they killed Rasputin. That was they wanted to remove that. So yes, the Germanness didn't help, but I think it's more the influence of Rasputin that caused the problem. And she was making a lot of stupid decisions. I mean, and that showed Nicholas's helplessness in allowing her to exert this kind of power when he knew perfectly well that she didn't have much judgment, and he knew that she was under the influence of Rasputin. Um, And and then Cynthia goes on. The film underscores Lenin's hostility towards smoking, but did this personal attitude translate into any formal ban when he was in power? No, no, there wasn't. The film also highlights the Czech Legion and the White Forces, but did they ever truly have a realistic chance of defeating the Bolsheviks? Yes, they did. If not, what might they have done differently to improve their odds? No, I think it was they very much were in a strong position, the Czech Legion and the Whites, and it looked for a while as if the Bolsheviks would be defeated. And keep in mind, there was also the Allied intervention that was that helped the Whites, the Allied intervention, which was against the Bolsheviks. The what worked for the Bolsheviks was obviously their message. Their message was very radical, which was bread, peace, and land. I mean, that's something which everyone says. Hey, bread, peace, and land. All the peasants, land for the peasants, bread for everyone, and of course peace. We end the war, and all power to the Soviets. So all power to the Soviets. Now, as it turned out, the Bolsheviks never delivered on any of that. But the whites had the problem that no one really thought that the whites would support giving land to the peasants. They thought the whites would bring back the aristocracy. And that really worked very much against the whites. Um, and the Czech Legion, they really were on the really brink of defeating the Bolsheviks. They were a very significant force there. But the Bolsheviks, as I say, not just that they had the message that could galvanize support on their behalf, they were also very ruthless in the way they went about fighting the war. I mean, they would go to Tsarist officers, and then they would threaten to kill their families unless they worked for the Bolsheviks. So it's like basically they took their families hostage, and so they used the kind of military expertise of the Tsarist officers, and that of course helped them. But they were absolutely ready to kill the families of these officers. Indeed, they were ready to kill the officers themselves if they didn't follow the orders of the Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks had that real ruthlessness about them. And then, of course, that kind of raises another issue, which was highlighted in the film, which was, well, what actually um, happened with the family, because you know they were taken, they were taken to this house in Yekaterinburg, um, and there was this mass execution. They killed Nicholas, they killed Alexandra, they killed the children, they killed the servants, they killed the doctor. Um, but afterwards, this area was overrun by the whites really within days. So they executed them, I think, because they knew the whites were very close, and that if the whites overran them, then the whites would probably take the Tsar and his family, and maybe they would use them for propaganda purposes. They would maybe even talk about restoring the Romanovs, whatever. So that's why the Bolsheviks made that decision to execute the Tsar and the family. But what then happened was quite interesting, because the Bolsheviks wanted to remove all evidence of their crime, and so they dug a pit. They used explosives. They used acid, but they couldn't destroy all of the remnants. I mean, there's a lot of bodies to destroy. So when the whites overtook this Yekaterinburg, they conducted an investigation. The this examining magistrate, this white examining magistrate, Sokolov, I think his name was Sokolov, and he kind of he carried on. He examined the house, and he saw the blood stain. I mean, they washed a lot of the blood off, but there was still enough blood stains left. There was the sort of the jewels that were worn by the daughters. Um, and then he kind of interviewed, in his investigation, he interviewed people who had seen comings and goings from this house, and he found the pit where they actually dumped the bodies. But there was, he didn't really find the bodies there. I mean, he found remnants of things. He found remnants of bones and everything. And so he concluded that the Tsar and his family had been massacred. But he then said that the Bolsheviks had destroyed all trace of the bodies, um, which wasn't correct. What the Bolsheviks had done is that they dug up, because there were still remnants left. So they dug up the remnants of the bodies and then went to bury them somewhere else. Sokolov didn't know where they had done it, so he had concluded they just simply had destroyed the bodies completely. And so that remained hidden until 1979, when some people found the remnants of the bodies, but nothing happened with that. They just simply they found the bodies there. They found this where they the second burial site. But this is they're still in the Soviet Union. They didn't exactly know how the Soviet government is going to respond to that, so they just left it there. But then, during Glasnost, they kind of alerted the authorities. This, hey, I think this is the final burial site of the Tsar and his family. And then indeed, the Gorbachev's government did say, yeah, this was the final dumping. It's not really a burial site; it's the final dumping ground of the Tsar and his family. But the fact that we know that they killed the family, that they didn't just kill Nicholas, that was because of the Sokolov, and it was Sokolov who published his findings, his report, and so that became widely known that the entire family had been butchered. But what's striking there is that the Soviet government, they never acknowledged that they butchered the family. They did acknowledge that Nicholas had been executed without a trial or anything like that. He had been executed. So they did accept that they'd given him no trial. They just simply shot him. But they never acknowledged that the entire family had been butchered. So if you looked in all the Soviet encyclopedias, they said that Tsar Nicholas had been executed by a decision of the, I think, Ural Soviet, which itself was a kind of a ridiculous way of putting it, because obviously the decision was taken at a much higher level. It was, taken at the level of Lenin and Sverdlov. Um, what's also interesting is that there was another report about the execution, and that was written by the guy that we saw in that film yesterday. Very, very sinister guy. He was the elderly man. I forget his name now. The elderly man with the stick, who kind of looked like a benign old man, but he was the one who really organized the execution. And he wrote a report that actually was kept hidden. I mean, so his report, I think, was published during Glasnost, and that more or less corroborated everything that was in the report of Sokolov. But I mean, it's particularly shocking what they did. I mean, as I say, there was no execution, and it's the entire family that they butchered. I mean, it was really a horrific episode. The film kind of didn't dwell on that. I mean, there was a tension that led to the execution, but it was over pretty quickly. I mean, all the labors that they went to remove all traces of the killings. They skipped all that, and I can see why. I don't think anyone really wants to see it. Anyway, Cynthia then goes on. Says, how did Lenin succeed in presenting himself as the voice of Russian revolution after returning on the sealed train that concealed the fact that his journey was financed by enemy Germany and covertly engineered by Alexander Parvus, Fatty Parvus, a capitalist operator masquerading as a Marxist revolutionary? That is a really good question. And I've never fully understood exactly how he managed to get away with it. And of course, in the West, he was indeed accused of working for the Germans, because not only did the Germans pay for him and facilitated his getting to Russia, but then his first act was basically, we're suing for peace. That's it. We're gonna we're not gonna fight at all. And then of course they signed that humiliating peace agreement. It was the Bolsheviks who signed an agreement. Nobody else would have done it. The Bolsheviks under Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, Lenin may well have calculated that Germany wasn't going to win the war, and that if Germany was going to lose in the West, then the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would be rendered null and void. He may have calculated that, but either way, he's the one who insisted on signing it. I mean, the Bolsheviks, even they were not prepared to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I mean, they just thought, this is just so humiliating. We can't do it. And Lenin said, no, we got to do it, because the only chance we have of holding on to power in Russia is if we get Germany off our back. We end the war, the Germans are not going to disturb us, and then we can consolidate our power, and then probably Germany is going to lose the war in the West, and then you know, we'll be in control. If Germany, of course, had Germany won the war, then of course the Germans would have knocked Lenin out, and they would have just simply run the whole show themselves. They didn't particularly like Lenin, but they just saw him as very useful. So how did he get away with that? I think people were just so pissed off with the war, so angry about everything, that they really didn't care very much, as long as they had Lenin's message, which was bread, peace, and land. They would follow. But you're absolutely right. It is quite extraordinary that it was never held against him, and I guess that's the revolutionary zeal of the Bolsheviks. That they just the kind of thing that somebody would think, hey, look, we're being held by the Germans. They're held by the people who are the enemies of our country. I said, well, we don't care. We only care about the socialist revolution. I mean, Lenin was a very deceitful person. I mean, he didn't really let on in 1917 the plans that he actually had. I mean, he intended to establish a dictatorship. I mean, the dictatorship of the proletariat, even though he was presenting himself as, bread, peace, and land, all power to the Soviets, as if he was this almost like an anarchist. Anarchy was the last thing he was interested in. But it worked for him in 1917 to suggest that he just wants, hey, give all power to everybody, all power to the peasants, power to the Soviets. The last thing I want is to establish a communist party dictatorship. But you're right. It's quite extraordinary how he was able to get away with doing that. Essentially financed by the enemies of Russia. Anne Marie, always very good to see you, Anne Marie. Anne Marie says, we had -6 here in Basel, and as I'm always late to leave for the rehearsal, I took the bike nonetheless. Wow. Well, I might I might also take the bike if it were just cold, because I can live with the cold. But if there's snow, because if there's snow, and then that means there's ice underneath the snow, then I'm always afraid of slipping, and with reason. I will slip in the snow, so I don't ride the bicycle in the snow. It was just very cold. As long as you can wrap yourself up warm, I can ride a bicycle, but I just don't do it on the snow. But congratulations! I mean, that's very that's very good. That you did it to get to the rehearsal. And since Anne Marie brings up a rehearsal, I should remind Gagglers that Anne Marie is an outstanding and a very distinguished musician who plays in the finest orchestras in the world, and has done so for some years, and has worked with outstanding conductors and composers, and worked really with some of the best musicians in the world. Um, and we're always very fortunate to have her musical contributions. And I saw just before we started that she's just written something on Richard Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra. I haven't had a chance to read Anne Marie's comments. I'm really looking forward to reading them. But it's always wonderful to have Anne Marie here, and always wonderful to enjoy her very learned and very informative musical commentary from an outstanding musician. So that's I'm just always amazed to to read the insights of somebody who actually plays music and knows all the inner workings and all the the differences between um, this way of interpreting a piece of work and another way of interpreting, which is just if you're inside the music business, then these things make sense. So I'm always learning a great deal from Anne Marie. So thank you so much. And then Cynthia says, FYI, the two black guards in the film shown below aren't fictional. They represent real Abyssinian guards, a court tradition dating back to Peter the Great, originally recruited from Ethiopia by the time of Nicholas II. Some were African Americans, including the best known Jim Hercules. The role was largely ceremonial. In striking uniforms, they guarded the palace doors and announced the arrival of Tsar or Empress. So, how and why did Ethiopians become part of the Russian court? Um, well, the Russians, I mean, I don't know the specifics of this, but the Russians were quite involved in the Middle East. They were the protectors of the Christians in the Levant, and of course Ethiopia. There's many Christians in Ethiopia, so um, but it's always been a kind of interesting that in Africa there was in all countries in Africa that Ethiopia was where there were the most Christians, and so that may well be the connection that with Ethiopia, which is that um, Russia protected the Christians of Ethiopia. But I will check up on that. I mean, that's an excellent question. I mean, that would be my guess. That's something to do with the Russia as the protector of the Christians. But I'd love to know more, and I'll I'll, I'll look into that and let you know. Thank you. Um, so, and Anne Marie always thank you so much for your generosity. And then Dale, oh, it's always good to see you here, Dale. Dale says, "Hi George. Peter said the other day that studying international law is akin to studying Sanskrit. Do you agree with him? What is your take?" Well, I mean, I think what he meant by that was that this is an interesting intellectual exercise. But Sanskrit, like Latin or ancient Greek, I mean, it's a dead language. So you study it, as in order to, it's obviously academically interesting, and you always want to know about how it influenced modern languages. Um, I think yes, international law is as a subject is kind of interesting. I mean, we talked earlier today about international law, sovereignty, sovereign equality, um, the sovereignty of states is a part of international law. I mean, you can't get anything more basic than that as a part of international law. The problem is that people ignore it. I mean, I was saying about how Trump. You would have thought Trump would want to to maintain the sovereign immunity. Somebody who's himself been the victim of lawfare, and rather than internationalizing lawfare. I mean, you would have thought that it's just not in his interest to do so, but Trump often does things that aren't really in his interest. But that's still a part of international law, and the various the various aspects that we've come to understand as international law. Again, and this always goes back to sovereignty. For instance, diplomatic immunity, the protection of embassies, and all that. That's clearly a part of international law. And as I say, that's still part of the sovereign equality of states. But you don't touch diplomats. Why don't you touch diplomats? Because you have no right to judge the representatives of another state. One state doesn't have the right to judge the representatives of another state. Um, so this is all part of the body of international law, and I think the issue here is that invoking international law because you don't like what somebody else has done, I think is a completely pointless exercise. The United States and NATO always violate, what is deemed international, or you could say they went to war against Libya, Iraq, Yugoslavia, all without the imprimatur of the United Nations. They can say, well, that's a violation of international law. You didn't get that. They say, well, so what? You can go off. You can make these arguments, but then they'll say, so what? And that's the thing. You can argue that Trump violated international law in invading Venezuela, seizing its leader, hauling him off to prison in the United States. Okay, so what's anyone going to do about that? And that's why I just feel that when people start expostulating on this as a horror, then it's as if, well, before this and this action, there used to be something called international law, and everybody adhered to it, and everybody agreed to it, and everybody observed it, and we lived in this lawful, civilized uh, international society where and then until Trump came along and violated it all. It's nonsense. Just about every major event um, since you know through the 20th and 21st centuries would be in violation of international law. So that's why I think it's a they could just argue anything. Britain's Suez adventure, America in Vietnam, America's war in Central America. I mean, you can just go. The list just goes on and on and on. None of them was in conformity with international law, and therefore I just think it's just a waste of time to bring this up. Now, in the context of an academic seminar, they're quite interesting. You go, students can discuss, well, to what extent did this action conform to our understanding of international law? And then you say, well, no, it didn't. And then, and that's why I think it's interesting. Like the study of Sanskrit is interesting, but it doesn't guide anyone because states act in accordance with what they perceive as their interest, and if they think it's a vital interest, then they ignore international law, and so therefore this I mean what I think I find so obnoxious is the idea that there exists something called the rules based order, and there is something called international law that the Western states adhere to. The Western states irregularly, almost all the time, ignore international law, including by unilaterally imposing sanctions, which is not in conformity with the United Nations Charter. Right, but you can bring it up. You're free to bring it up at UN meetings, and the representatives of the Western powers will probably be playing with their phones when you bring that up. So I think that's that. I think that's why interesting, but not really a useful guide to anything. Anyway, Robert, good to see you, Robert. And Robert says, you have to wonder whether Dmitry Medvedev will seize the chance to troll everyone, including NATO, Mette Frederiksen, and Donald Trump, by offering Denmark a security pact. Well, yes, that would be kind of amusing if he did so. I don't think I don't think he's much in the mood. Mette Frederiksen is actually one of the most Russophobic of all of the Western NATO leaders. I mean, leave aside all the Baltic leaders, leave aside Poland, and some of the others, but of the leaders in the West, I think she's really the most rabidly anti-Russian. So I don't know whether he would particularly offer offer her. I would have thought he would more than likely just be gleeful at the prospect of Denmark getting clobbered. Because if Denmark gets clobbered, no one is going to lift a finger. They will probably conclude that Mette Frederiksen should have worked out a deal with Trump. I mean, if they're not, no one is going to liquidate NATO for Greenland, and I think Trump knows this. So when Mette Frederiksen said, as we was watching earlier, "Oh, this will be the end of NATO." No, it's not going to be the end of NATO. No one is going to sacrifice NATO for Greenland. What do they care about Greenland? What do they care whether Greenland's controlled by Denmark or controlled by the United States? It's still going to be NATO land. I mean, it's still going to be under NATO control. It doesn't really matter. So they're going to tell Mette Frederiksen, look, you've seen what Trump is like. Um, no one's going to do anything to protect you. No one's going to do anything to protect Greenland from the United States. So work something out. Work out a deal. Sell him. Name an asking price, or say you're going to lease it to the United States for 100 years. But don't imagine that that we're going to preside over the dissolution of NATO. They're not willing to give NATO up. So that's but so I would imagine Medvedev is just chuckling with malicious glee over the embarrassment to Mette Frederiksen. I mean, I just find her particularly. I don't know. There's just something about her that's just kind of rubs me up the wrong way, and I'm sure Medvedev probably feels the same way. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And then Summer Petros. Good to see you, Summer Petros. Summer Petros is a scientist and a fluent Hungarian speaker. So good to have both here at the Gaggle, a scientist and a Hungarian speaker. Anyway, Summer Petros says, George, what if the view that U.S. foreign policy is largely determined by Secretary Rubio and Trump's role is merely PR, social media, and press conferences? That's a very good question. We kind of think that this Venezuela project is Rubio's, and that may be the case. However, let's keep in mind that the Venezuela project predates Trump's second term, because he became quite preoccupied with Venezuela during his first term, and at that time Rubio was not in the administration. So it's hard to know. I mean, why Trump became so preoccupied with Venezuela. I mean, there are various theories about this, and I know Robert Barnes has put forward a theory about Paul Singer. It's a way of bailing out Paul Singer to get some money out of Venezuela and into the Paul Singer's coffers. Maybe, but it may also just be that Trump is annoyed that he failed so spectacularly in Venezuela. Remember, during his first term, he tried various operations against Venezuela, a couple of coups, recognizing Guaido as the president. They even tried a kind of half-baked invasion, and I think that I think that so I think it was always an unfinished business with that. Um, and I think there's the other aspect of it is what he did during his first term was to rely on kind of indigenous forces within Venezuela. In other words, to rely on the opposition, rely on the sort of the democratic uh, leaders, Guaido and the National Assembly and so on. And then he found that they were all spectacular failures. They didn't deliver for him. And I think that helped fuel his determination that he's going to rely on American power. And I just have a feeling that that's a Trump decision. That's not a Marco Rubio decision. Rubio would probably still go for the let's back the opposition. Here are the people who won the election. Here's Machado. She won the Nobel Peace Prize. We should rely on them. Um, but Trump said, no, I'm sick of that. We tried that during my first term. The only way we're going to make any changes is by using U.S. force directly. So I kind of think that has a Trumpian feel to it. I don't see that as a Rubio idea. Just that I can see that that's how Trump would think. I don't think that's how Rubio would think. But I think it's a very good question. Um, and really, when you see the dynamic of Trump and Rubio, I don't see Rubio as leading Trump. I don't see him as the guiding force with Trump. I think this is Trump's decision. Foolish in many ways, but yeah, I think it's he's the one who makes those decisions. Anyway, thank you so much, Summer Petros. Marty, I was wondering who's Marty always introduces himself with his with excellent memes, and here is this meme of Brezhnev. This is quite an elderly Brezhnev. So he's got a I mean, it's not a life jacket. It's one of those things you call lifesavers. So he's swimming with a lifesaver, but he's also wearing a swimming cap. I've never seen this picture. That's very interesting. Um, Brezhnev's he kind of he deteriorated physically very dramatically in his late years, and I have to wonder why that was, because when he died he wasn't that old. I can't remember how old he was. It was maybe about 75, so he looked a lot older. um just like here, he kind of looks really terrible, kind of very bloated. And I mean, I guess it's a lot of alcohol will do that to you, um, and presumably the Soviet leaders notoriously did not lead a particularly healthy lifestyle. I mean, no workout merchants. I mean, so you know generally they were pretty sedentary, and in his case, he tended to imbibe quite a lot. Um, it is kind of sad to see in his late years that the drastic physical deterioration that took place. Because when you look at him when he took over as leader from Khrushchev, and he became party general secretary. He was a very handsome man. You have to say, if you like that type of Russian masculinity, which he had, he exuded a certain masculinity. But he was a handsome man. That was about 1964. So he died in 82. So during those 18 years, he really did undergo a drastic deterioration. But that's true also of Boris Yeltsin. You look at Boris Yeltsin in 1991, at the time of the coup, when he was standing on top of the tank, and then you look at him in 1999, in his pretty much at the end of his reign. I mean, that's 8 years. just an amazing physical deterioration that took place. Anyway, thank you so much, Marty. That's an interesting picture. I've never seen that. Um, and then Robert says, wasn't the clumsy bribery a long-standing U.S. Practice, only becoming classified with the creation of the CIA? Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore was one of the CIA's early targets, supposedly with the aim of containing communism. And so, isn't what's remarkable about the CIA's bribery of the Venezuelan military only the breathtaking scale of it? Absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. Bribery is an old CIA tactic. Also, MI6 did this, and it does make a lot of sense because it's very cheap. Um, if you can bribe some leaders, you know, give everyone $100,000. How many people do you have to pay off? All right, 100,000. So let's say you have to pay off 50 people. All right, that's only 5 million. That's not that's that's easy. That's chump change. Let's pay off 100 people, so it's 10 million. It's nothing for a country like the United States. That really, it just comes out of the petty cash. And if you pay off 100 people, yeah, you can get rid of the leader that you wanted out. They did that in Yugoslavia when they toppled Milosevic. They bribed all of the people around him. I mean, all the talk about otpor and people power, it's all nonsense. The key was you bribe your head of your military, the head of your secret police, um, your head of internal security, or you bribe all of them, and you make clear that they're going to do nothing to defend Milosevic. In other words, hey, Milosevic turns around and says, "Hey, there's all these riots outside. Can I rely on you to provide me with security?" Nope, you can't. All right, well, that's it. Probably something like that happened in the case of Yanukovych as well. Um, so that's how they play this. It's actually a very good investment. It's clear from the smoothness with which this transition has taken place in Caracas that pretty much everyone at the highest level of government was paid off. Um, the one thing that does interest me, and we'll see what the answer is to this, is what happens now with his court case, because the media reporting that he's hired this guy Barry Pollock as his defense attorney. Now he's a top class attorney who obviously commands a hefty fee. Now, who's going to pay that fee? Well, I would assume, well, the Venezuelan government will pay that fee. Well, Venezuela is under sanctions. So then the question is, will the United States allow Venezuela to pay Barry Pollock? They might. They might decide. But if Maduro decides to mount a very aggressive defense, I can see the U.S. government saying, well, we're not going to allow any transfer of money from Venezuela to the Maduro Legal Defense Fund. So that's going to be a dampener on any legal defense that Maduro might want to mount. They say no. Well, Venezuela is under sanction. We ban people from any kind of financial transactions with Venezuela. So we have to see about how that's going to play out. So Uh, and I guess the Venezuelan government might say, "Well, good, we'll save some money. We don't have to pay for his defense." Anyway, then Dennis Misty and says, "I remember reading Miss Miller's feeling for snow, but I don't think it justifies Denmark's claim to Greenland." I don't know. I mean, Denmark has a claim going back to Norway and whatever, and that's fine. You can go on making those claims. But if the United States says we want it, I don't think those claims are going to count for very much. And again, you reap what you sow. When you show complete disdain for the legal claims of others, then no one's going to pay pay much attention to your legal claims. Anyway, my time is up. So thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Thank you very much for all of your really interesting questions and comments and ideas and so on. Really good. Thank you so much, everybody who chipped into the tip jar. I have to deal with the dogs tomorrow. Always very grim time. So, but I'm going to show the tip jar. Look, people contribute. Don't berate me. So anyway, but thank you so much. We will be back on Thursday, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Look forward to seeing you then. Until then, all the best. Good night. Bye bye.